This story, even before the heroine's rebirth, did not end as well as the girl would have liked. Her name was Lydia Evans, and she was forced to work off her sentence in a secret labor camp. But this lady's only fault was that at the time she chose the wrong man. Richard Neville became the cause of the cruel fall of the heroine, who sincerely gave him love. And now Lydia was reaping the fruits of her stupidity, serving her exile in the cold quarries. If you think about it, it would be impossible to imagine a worse candidate for a husband for a noble lady. But love so clouded Lady Evans's mind that she herself proposed to this man. Thanks to this, the former commoner quickly earned status and even ascended to the throne. Lydia was glad that her husband was achieving such success in his career and life. Who would have thought that in the end, the guy would choose a completely different girl as the empress? This is how the heroine found herself outside the happy story, as she became of no use to anyone. Pain constantly tormented the heart of the abandoned girl, who was not ready to accept such a defeat. Despair always pushes people to terrible deeds, and the young aristocrat was no exception. She had something terrible in mind, because only the most insidious person would decide to poison a pregnant woman. But at that moment, the lady was blinded by the thirst for revenge, so she did not think about the consequences. Lydia wanted her ex-husband to suffer from the loss of love as much as she did. However, it all ended in failure, and the girl ended up serving her sentence while others were having fun. During this time, Evans had time to rethink her life, and now blamed only Richard for everything. She understood that nothing could change her fate, but she still tried for the sake of freedom. But cruel fate decreed otherwise, because Lydia soon contracted a fatal disease. Many prisoners in the quarries suffered from this disease, and no one could find a cure. So the heroine's days were numbered, and she only regretted that she had wasted her life so foolishly. Before her death, the girl dreamed of being reborn, which would allow her to become happy and free. And suddenly, her whole life began to flash before the eyes of Lydia, who was constantly delirious. The heroine had a hard time looking at herself from the outside because she saw only stupidity and lack of restraint. The most painful thing for her was to watch how she constantly ran after Richard for his love. At that time, Lydia did not yet know that this man would not keep a single promise for her. At the moment of the heroine's death, a miracle happened, and she was able to be reborn several years into the past. Previously, the girl did not believe in miracles, so it was difficult for her to accept the new reality. But Evan's feelings told her that she really was still alive, although logically, this was impossible. It so happened that the lady returned at the moment when Richard discovered poison in her hands. But Lydia had only just traveled back in time, so she could hardly understand what was happening. However, the bottle of poison in her hands proved that the miss really was going to poison her husband's mistress. This meant that the heroine could once again go down a bad path that would lead her to death. Only now the lady no longer believed that her life was worth wasting on stupid revenge. What angered Lydia most was that she had traveled back in time at that very moment. But everything could have turned out much better if Evans had arrived just a couple of days earlier. The girl understood that a search of her would be inevitable, and she really did bring poison with her. Only Giselle had the right to examine the aristocrat, and this lady was willing to take such a risk. Only Richard's sweet words stopped the lady, as the guy was afraid of losing his beloved. At the sight of them, the heroine's disgust flared up with renewed vigor, because that was not why she returned to the past. And in the end, Lydia was once again forced to watch the lovers flirt with each other. Previously, the girl would have definitely burst into tears on the spot, because Richard had abandoned her so cruelly. But now she only rudely sobered herself up to throw this unworthy man out of her head. No one expected such strange behavior from Lydia, although they thought that she would be out of her mind. At that moment, the heroine decided once and for all that she would no longer think about men. So began her great game, in which she portrayed a poor and unhappy girl. The aristocrats around clearly didn't think that the lady might be saving the poison for herself. Lydia easily made it look like she was going to die because of her beloved husband's betrayal. This was not to Richard's advantage, as all this time he wanted to blame Evan's daughter for something. But instead, the emperor's reputation was on the line as he drove the lady to suicide. This is exactly what the heroine was trying to achieve. She was not going to suffer any longer because of her husband's fault. As the girl expected, the knights immediately stopped her from attempting suicide. But in all the confusion, no one noticed that a few drops of poison still got into the young lady's mouth. At the height of the commotion, Arson Edith, who was the best knight in the empire, suddenly burst into the room. The heroine knew this man well, who had to hide his real name. She could only trust her life to him. Since Arson never harmed other people, the girl's consciousness darkened with each passing second, as the poison was already spreading through her blood. But she desperately called for the guy whose family had been burned many years ago by order of the emperor. Only together could they restore justice, since both had suffered at the hands of the ruler. At the moment when the young man picked up the girl, he did not expect to hear his last name from her. Arsène didn't even tell his closest aides that he belonged to the Baron family. So the knights were much more impressed by the fact that Lydia boldly called their master by name. Only Edith heard that young Evans somehow knew more about him than she told others. But now the heroine was on the verge of death, although she had only recently been reborn after death. Quite quickly, rumors that Lydia had fallen into Arsen's arms spread among all the servants. The assistants always discussed love stories with interest, so this case was no exception. Edith never broke the image of a great hero and swordsman who was not interested in ladies. And here he was, personally sitting next to the bed of the Marcus Evans' daughter, who had not come to her senses. In fact, the guy was afraid to leave the girl because she somehow knew his real last name. So his supervision of Lydia's condition was merely a precaution and attentiveness. No man who had hidden from the emperor for so many years would want to be discovered. That's why it was so important for him to get answers from the girl who was now unconscious. It was for this reason that Arsène never left the lady's side, even though rumors of love were circulating everywhere. But his family was indeed destroyed many years ago by the emperor, albeit as a result of a mistake. However, all this time, the young man managed to successfully hide from the wrath of the ruler, who considered himself wise. The boy was pulled out of his thoughts by Lydia's plaintive voice, who was noticeably cold under the thin blanket. Arsène could not even imagine that the Marquise's daughter would be so poorly cared for in her own home. Instead of interrogating the lady, Edith had to personally look after her health. All this confused the heir of the Byron family, who was already confused in his thoughts. The heroine soon came to her senses, although awakening was not easy for her. Through her narrowed eyelashes, the lady could barely make out the image of an unknown handsome guy. As soon as Lydia concentrated her gaze, she instantly recognized Arsène Bayrain next to her. It was a mystery to the heroine why this gloomy guy stayed next to her all this time. But after waking up, Lady Evans really needed help, so she didn't drive him away. Now that the heroine had returned to life for the second time, she was not going to miss this chance. The lady no longer planned to let men into her life, because they only brought problems. Instead, Lydia wanted to save the people from the quarries and then take revenge on Richard in a big way. And in carrying out this complex plan, the girl could use the help of someone like Arsène. The guy clearly didn't expect that, after waking up, Lydia would be so active and noisy. The whole point was that Evans had completely forgotten about her recent suspicious behavior, but she accidentally revealed Arsen's real last name, which could have had serious consequences for her. That is why the young man did not move a single step away from the Marquise's daughter, burning with curiosity all night. For the first time in his life, he met a person who knew something about his past. Cold sweat covered the heroine's entire body, who at that moment cursed her chatty tongue. Who would believe that Lydia knew all this only because of reincarnation? But the lady had no right to lie to Arsène, since she wanted to secure his support in the future. That's why she told the truth about the second life. Although it sounded like an incredible miracle, it was not at all surprising that the young man's face reflected all the skepticism and bewilderment. Arsène had a difficult childhood, so he didn't believe in miracles, and something like this was impossible for him. He was one of those people who considered only his own judgments and worldviews to be correct. That's why it was so difficult for the heroine to convince Arsène that she had no intention of lying to him. Only the names of the prisoners in the quarry, whom Edith knew, were able to stop him in his tracks. From childhood, the young man searched for the people who had saved him from death and the hands of the emperor. In her past life, Lydia met these people who were languishing in prison. She knew Byron and Nella well, who had done so much for the young heir of the family. Even if Arsène refuses to help her, the girl will still try to save these people, all because it was they who saved her from starvation in those terrible quarries. Then, Byron and Nella became the first who dared to approach the disgraced woman. And following them, Marie, who also suffered from the man, ignored all the prejudices. At the moment when Lydia first arrived at the quarries, she cursed her cruel fate. Then the girl was ready to die for the simple reason that she did not want to live without Richard. But Nella was the first to surround the nervous girl with care so that she would not even think about suicide. Lydia was then supported by Marie, although her position was much worse than that of the aristocrat. It was only thanks to these people that the heroine melted and stopped thinking about killing herself. Byron, Nella, and Marie became saviors for Lady Evans, who lost all her friends due to exile. That's why the girl was so eager to get these people out of prison as quickly as possible. They all died long before they could escape, and the lady feared a repetition of this tragedy. Of course, Miss would never have been able to save her friends on her own, so she needed Arsène's help. But the guy's face didn't reflect a drop of trust. Even though Lydia tried to be honest with him, Byron was not ready to believe such a strange story that did not correspond to his picture of the world. However, the sincerity in the aristocrat's voice still touched the guy, who usually remained stern. This matter still haunted Arsène, who had long wanted to find his childhood relatives. And all of Lydia's words were too close to the truth, for which the guy could not find an explanation. The seed of doubt that the heroine had sown in Edith nevertheless began to gradually sprout in his thoughts. The least the gentleman could do was to check the existence of those quarries in the Empire. However, he couldn't shake the feeling that Lydia had made up this whole story out of loneliness. Something was not adding up in Arsène's head, and he desperately tried not to give in to panic and sadness. At this moment, Lydia's older brother still hadn't waited for the guests to come to the tea party to which he had been invited. But Devon wasn't one to get upset if he was ignored for some reason. Moreover, the butler was sure that Edith had feelings for the Marquise's young daughter. In his head, their feelings were so strong and tender that nothing could separate the two lovers. And there was no one to explain to the old man that he shouldn't romanticize the boy's ordinary help. The butler always suffered from the fact that he found love where there was never even a hint of it. The saddest thing was that Devon still trusted his assistant, whose abilities were at their best. So the guy couldn't miss such a good chance to legally expand his wealth. Since the Marquise was ill, his son was not afraid to use all means to get rich. So for a week, Lydia was not allowed to leave her room so that she would not run away. But the heroine used this time wisely and came up with several options for action at once. True, a lot depended on whether her older brother would finally allow the house arrest to be lifted. When the girl visited Devon, he was just finishing up sorting out one of the important documents. During this time, the guy managed to find a new groom for Lydia, who was approved by Emperor Richard himself. The girl couldn't even imagine that her ex-husband would wish her an old man with children. And even the elder brother did not object to the emperor's decision for the sake of his sister's future. Lydia had always known she shouldn't have trusted Devon, but now she was completely convinced of it. The guy wanted his sister to run and cry to Arsène, and he would accept her into his family. The heroine was so indignant that she couldn't even find the words to properly put the elder in his place. She didn't even think about resorting to Edith's help, because she hadn't yet been able to win his trust. In case Devon got in the lady's way, she already had a good course of action in store. To survive, Miss was not afraid to use people and neglect them, just as they once offended her. That's why the girl decided to become a priestess, so that no one else could marry her off. Aristocrats rarely chose this path, as they were forced to give up a lot. But Lydia didn't care about public opinion, after she had already died once. The girl didn't even want to think about getting close to a man, so she decided to become a priestess. If she hadn't met Richard in her life, she really could have found a worthy man. And now, everything inside the heroine was boiling with righteous anger, just because of one thought about love. That is why the lady no longer planned to stay at the estate where her brother wanted to marry her off. If her father had been healthy, the lady would never have had to run away from her own home. And now all the doors were blocked for Lydia, but no one stopped her from going out the window. Lady Evans was full of anticipation of the journey that would lead her to freedom. Meanwhile, under cover of night, Arsène secretly made his way to the Marquise's daughter's room. He did this only because he did not want to face unpleasant rumors about love again. Otherwise, nothing would have stopped the guy from coming on an official visit to Lydia. But circumstances turned out such that Arsène arrived so quietly and unnoticed that he was not caught by the guards. Who would have thought that the guy would appear near the heroine's room at the most opportune moment? It was at this time that Lydia ran into problems, because her body had not been hardened in the quarries. So the heroine's strength left her after just a couple of minutes, and she didn't have time to descend to the ground. The most terrible thing for the girl was that she heard a familiar voice very close to her. No matter how Edith felt about this lady, he was unable to leave her in a helpless situation. The guy saw perfectly well that Lydia's strength was almost exhausted, and she could have suffered. Only Arson's amazing knightly skills helped him catch the young lady in time. The heroine clearly did not expect such a result, but remained grateful to her wonderful savior. Everything would have been fine if the lady had put on a dress that was much longer and more fluffy before escaping. As a result, she found herself in an embarrassing situation, which was unacceptable for young ladies. When Miss asked to put it down, suddenly embarrassment was reflected on Arson's face. In her embarrassment, Lydia expressed herself incorrectly, so the guy adjusted her clothes instead of letting her go. The heroine's heart began to beat wildly when she felt Edith's hot touch on her skin. In her past life, the girl had already experienced intimacy with Richard, but it was unlike anything else. The only thing that saved the heroine from turning crimson was the fact that they heard the footsteps of the maids nearby. Both the boy and the girl were not allowed to be seen by the servants, who would wake up the entire estate. It was only after some time that Arsène realized what exactly the Marquise Evans' daughter had meant. But the moment was missed, and Byron was glad that his embarrassment was not visible in the darkness. Of course, the young man's speed was higher, so he offered the lady another way of moving. Arsène didn't want to linger long on Evans's territory, so he was ready to carry the girl on his back. The heroine had never tried anything like this before, but she was always ready to experiment. But the girl didn't expect that Arsène's physical abilities would be so powerful. The speed with which Edith ran through the forest almost deafened the poor and weak aristocrat. Arsène didn't even think of feeling sorry for the lady, since he also jumped an incredible distance into the air. All this in order to leave the Evans family territory, where he was not invited, in a couple of minutes. This is how the lady was able to escape from home without putting in any effort. At the same time, Byron maintained an impenetrable calm, despite the unexpected circumstances. So Lydia was once again convinced that she needed Arsène as a good assistant. Initially, Miss planned to enter the temple to calmly accept the title of a real priestess. But the heir of the Byron family had no intention of letting go of the man who knew his secret. He remembered all too well the words of his mother, who begged her son not to tell anyone his last name. When the emperor accused the Byron family of treason, their entire estate was set on fire. The grandfather and father gave their lives so that Arsène and his mother could be saved. They and their servants safely escaped from the estate, which soon turned into nothing but a pile of ashes. The boy and his mother fled to a distant relative, but along the way, some of their acquaintances were caught by the guards. And in the end, only Arsène reached Abraham Edith, who secretly raised him as a son. From that moment on, the boy's heart was forever closed by the pain that tore it into pieces. The newly minted Edith was never able to forget any of those who gave their lives for him. All the time, Arsène grew up with the thought that he was obliged to take revenge on the emperor for the death of his family. So the heir was not one of those who could easily let go of a suspicious person. That's why Byron kidnapped Lydia instead of obediently taking her to the temple. In fact, the heroine did not feel ill, despite the fact that her movements were limited. The guy remained a gentleman to the core, although he tried to appear stern and formidable. That's why Lydia wasn't afraid around Arsène, because she believed in his honesty. During the time they had not seen each other, Edith had indeed found his loved ones in the magical quarries. This is exactly what the heroine was counting on when she told the young man the whole truth about reincarnation. However, it was clear from Arsène's face that he still didn't fully trust the strange Lydia. But the heroine wanted to save her friends so much that she didn't care about such trifles. Moreover, she knew so much about the future that she had no doubt of her usefulness to young Byron. At this point, Edith believed he could trust the eldest son of the Evans family. Devon had long ago promised Arsène large lands for his constant help, and only the heroine knew that her brother should not have been trusted, because he thought only of himself. Byron's heir still had much to learn about this active and noisy lady. The girl understood perfectly well that her brother would give Arsène the land only if they got married. But the lady had no intention of following such a scenario, no matter how much she wanted to help her friend. Edith himself would prefer to remain single, since he always puts chivalry first. Before the guy had time to notice, he found himself drawn into the cheerful heroine's grandiose plans. First of all, Lydia planned to cure her father, who had been unconscious for many months. But all this time, Arson was sure that it was no longer possible to help Marquis Evan. But for some reason, the lady continued to behave as if nothing was impossible for her. What angered the heroine most was Arson's distrust, because she told him only one truth. In fact, Byron knew he shouldn't have trusted the current ruler of the empire. The problem was that the guy didn't really trust the girl sitting in front of him. However, he did not upset Lydia with a refusal, which quickly made Miss delighted. The heroine had a ready plan for a long time, and Arsene's agreement only improved its execution. For her own safety, the girl dreamed of becoming a priestess so that no one would touch her again. Of course, Edith did not expect that the plans of the Marquis's daughter would be so different from the desires of the girls. Lydia acted so relaxed, as if she had never thought about committing suicide by poison. She was genuinely happy that the foundation for her large-scale plans had finally been laid. No man at that moment could refuse such a cheerful girl. So Byron was no exception. Although he always seemed steadfast and strict towards the ladies, no matter how much he resisted, for some reason, this lady took away all the desire to argue from the young man. Her appearance seemed so sweet to him that for the first time in his life, Arsène could not resist. So Edith personally made sure the lady slept in his temporary shelter. The girl was embarrassed by the fact that the guy suddenly offered her his sleeping place. She still perceived Arsène as a harmful aristocrat, but he was much kinder. The lady couldn't even imagine that even one guy would treat her so kindly. After communicating with Richard, Miss had become accustomed to the bad, which is why she was surprised when she saw Byron. Arsène himself had no idea how much he had struck the girl, who was not accustomed to attention and care. Because of the transformation, all the thoughts in Lydia's head were confused, so she was ready to sleep next to Edith. Out of stupidity, the heroine did not perceive Arsène as a real representative of the male sex. But before, Byron had never encountered a lady who underestimated him so much. Lydia was so tired that she couldn't think clearly, which sent her into a panic. But for some reason, the girl still believed that Arsène would not do anything bad to her. After her rebirth, the heroine got used to not taking the people around her seriously, and such reasoning touched the manhood of the young man, who considered himself an adult. So Arsène calmly reminded the lady that every guy can have bad thoughts. Only now did Evans realize how exactly her words had sounded to the heartthrob. This whole misunderstanding only happened because Richard convinced Lydia of her unattractiveness. Arsène would never have thought that the emperor would treat his wife so badly. The guy thought that this girl was worthy of the best and most caring partner in marriage. But the reality was much more cruel than the heir of the Byron family could have imagined. After hearing this, the guy was no longer able to be offended by the lady, who was not guilty of anything. Now he was ready to forgive the girl any stupidity on her part, because she had suffered a lot. A sudden loud sound from Lydia attracted the attention of Edith, who had almost left. The heroine immediately realized that the growling in her stomach was so audible to her friend. She did not abandon the decency of a lady, so because of this oversight, her embarrassment knew no bounds. Miss could only hope that Arsène would gallantly ignore her, but Byron was unable to leave the girl without food, which embarrassed her even more. But after just a few minutes, the heroine was finally able to enjoy delicious food. The girl's happiness knew no bounds, and she completely forgot about her recent shame in front of her friend. Watching the Marquis's daughter, Arsène suddenly realized that she reminded him of someone. The lady had never thought before about what might evoke sweet associations in other people. And in the end, Byron firmly remembered Lydia's behavior, like the appearance of a cute rabbit from the forest. It so happened that even the color of the girl's hair matched the shades of the rabbit's fur. The heroine was delighted that she looked like such a cute creature in the forest. Arsène himself did not expect that he would be so polite to the ladies, although he usually did not talk to them. Meanwhile, at the palace, Giselle was undergoing examination, as her birth was just around the corner. The girl was only glad that her baby was growing up to be a strong and healthy child even before birth. She didn't immediately notice that all this time, Richard had been thinking about something of his own, having forgotten about his wife. It wasn't the first time the guy remembered Lydia instead of focusing on Giselle. This would make any girl worry that Richard still had feelings for Evans. But the emperor was so eloquent that it was not difficult for him to console his beloved lady. He was truly more worried about whether Arsène would link his fate with the Marquis's fallen daughter. Giselle was also ready to provide their child with a happy and peaceful future. For this reason, even in this state, she decided to go to Devon Evans' estate. While the heroine had no idea that such intrigues were being woven behind her back, her morning began with an unknown guy knocking loudly on the front door of the room. This stranger did not give the lady any time to think, as he immediately threw the clothes into her hands. Lydia felt uneasy under the knight's gaze, which seemed to pierce her with icy spikes. Miss didn't plan to make Arson fall in love with her, but for some reason, this guy forbade her to do so. The knight allowed himself to laugh at the girl who could not keep the emperor near her. The heroine had never encountered people who treated a real aristocrat so harshly before. However, Miss tried to keep up appearances until the very end, so as not to spoil her relationship with anyone. But the guy only made the girl even more angry, although he was only supposed to bring clothes. As a result, Lydia looked angrily for a long time after the impudent knight, who did not respect her at all. So she didn't immediately hear the steps of Arson, who wanted to check on the lady. The guy could have easily reined in the naughty knight, but the heroine didn't want to complain to him. She remembered that the journey would still be long, so it was necessary to maintain the relationship. In fact, the girl had little time to get ready, since Edith had arranged for her to go to the temple. In her past life, Lydia couldn't even dream of becoming something like a real priestess, but now she was ready to devote her life to serving God, just so she wouldn't fall in love again. The priests had heard about the terrible character of Evan's daughter, so they did not believe her. No matter what beautiful words the lady spoke now, the rumors about her frightened people too much. The heroine was not stupid, so for this occasion, she prepared a small donation for the temple. No priest could refuse the gift, since the church's financial situation was always modest. So the lady had no difficulty in obtaining permission to receive the title of divine priestess. The only problem that could have arisen was that the priest needed a witness for this ritual. But Lydia had thought through this point too, since there were no flaws in her brilliant plan. She specially invited Giselle to this event, because she had something to bribe this lady with. The girl, with Arson's help, sent a letter in advance to the relative who took her place. Lydia knew that the emperor's current wife would not be able to refuse her small request. It was not surprising that Edith was skeptical of the marquise's daughter's confidence. But the lady knew very well how much Giselle wanted to become the adopted daughter of the Evans family. And for this, Richard's new wife needed Lydia's permission, so she came to her aid. The red-haired girl always tried to maintain good relations with her rival. And this time, the heroine had enough dignity not to grab the lady's beautiful hair. In fact, it was only to Giselle's advantage that Lydia was going to become a priestess in the temple. The lady didn't know about Richard's plans, so she was surprised that the girl considered her a sister. It seemed to the heroine that the struggle between them did not allow the relationship between the two sisters to be maintained. When Lydia announced that she did not consider Giselle a relative, it was her turn to be surprised. But Madame didn't even try to demand anything more from the girl whose place she so brazenly took. The ceremony passed quickly, but its consequences were not long in coming. Devon wasn't happy with what his sister had done while he was minding his own business. The guy understood perfectly well that the priestess's promises would not allow Lydia to look at Arson. He was only slightly consoled by the fact that Edith had volunteered to personally escort Lady Evans to the temple. This gave Devon hope that the relationship between Lydia and Arson could still work out. Even the status of a priestess did not prevent the marquise's daughter from ultimately choosing love over the temple. This was the only hope left for the heir of the Evans family, who wanted to get more money. For this reason, he forbade his sister to take anything from the estate, which the girl clearly did not expect. She was filled with rage, because her brother remained a greedy and petty man until the very end. As soon as the lady left, Devon put a sweet smile on his face for the sake of a possible relative. But Arson didn't plan to get close to a guy who could deceive him at any moment. However, Evans did not give up his dream that Edith would pay attention to young Lydia. Devon didn't mind the guy lending his shoulder to the girl if she got into trouble. Like a true knight, Arson planned to help the lady in everything, even without her older brother's request. So he was only bothered by such concern, which did not look sincere from the outside. The more Edith interacted with Evans, the more he began to hate his personality. Before, the guy hadn't noticed that Devon was ready to sell any person for profit. Previously, the marquise's son seemed to Arsène to be a decent man who always protected his loved ones. but something had changed the air so much that none of his friends recognized him anymore. For this reason, Biner had no desire to continue the conversation with his acquaintance. No matter how kindly the guy smiled, his words were no longer trusted. That's why Arson chose to run away from Devon, rather than listen to his insidious speeches. In the corridor, the young man met Lydia, who just wanted to talk to him before leaving. Edith felt that the lady was being mistreated there, so he did not want to leave her alone. Instead, the guy would have preferred to take the girl away right now, even though she hadn't had time to get ready. The friend's wishes surprised the heroine, who had actually been living well in the estate all this time. Lydia planned to do a little dirty trick to her brother, who had forbidden her to take anything with him. The girl hesitated for a long time before trusting Arson, who was helping her in this matter. But in the end, she admitted that she would stay at the estate, as she had one fun and important thing to do. Only the heroine knew that the Marquis had left diamonds for his children for a rainy day. It was this safe that Lydia decided to find, although she only roughly remembered its location. In the darkness, she did not immediately notice some suspicious object that was near her. The lady clearly remembered that there had never been anything so huge in this room before. As soon as Lydia got a better look at the object, horror gripped her entire body from head to toe. The whole point was that Devon had already bought a coffin for the Marquis, although he was still alive. Miss always knew her brother was crazy, but now he exceeded even her expectations. A strong resentment overwhelmed all the thoughts of the girl, who sincerely loved the wise Marquis. Kyle Evans wasn't always the best husband, but he was still a wonderful father to his children. That is why the lady was going to do everything to ensure that the Marquis would not need this coffin for a long time. Distracted from her sad thoughts, the lady continued her search for that very precious safe. From the outside, this thing looked like an unremarkable box that no one would likely take. But the heroine knew what wealth the safe contained, since her father had been collecting these diamonds for a long time. Before he fell into a coma, Kyle told his daughter about the funds he had carefully hidden. Only now did Miss realize that even then, the Marquis had not counted on Devon's support. In this life, Lydia had every chance to properly manage the inheritance left by her father. And now she had to figure out how to secretly remove all these diamonds from the estate. The next morning, Richard was the first to learn that Arson was leaving with Lydia. Edith calmly accepted the fact that she would miss an important celebration that would take place in the capital. He understood that Lydia would never have attended this event because the emperor had left her alone, but the boy didn't expect that the ruler would suddenly ask him to be careful with the young lady. Byron would never have believed that a girl could harm a knight like him, but Richard meant that Lydia had been out of her mind for a long time, so there was no point in expecting anything good. In his eyes, Devon was much smarter than the Marquis' daughter, who managed to quickly lose everything. In fact, Arson didn't even think about falling in love with a girl who had only recently become a priestess. Richard thought otherwise, as it was the first time he had seen his knight help a girl. But Edith quickly convinced the emperor otherwise, since he believed that he was telling him only the truth. So the ruler was glad that no one still looked at the woman he had spoiled. He had no idea how much these words angered Arson, who liked Lydia. If it weren't for his years of iron self-control, the boy would have definitely started a fight with the ruler at that moment. A few days later, the heroine met Arson, who was far from being in the best condition. This once again convinced the guy that the girl was really being treated badly at the estate. But the lady herself stubbornly did not see any problems in anything, since she had brought herself to this state. This attitude raised even more questions for Edith, who was accustomed to the aristocrats taking care of him. But for some reason, even Devon talked more about Giselle and how they needed to accept her into their family. The heroine could not refuse her brother, because he had the power to cancel her departure, since he became the head of the family. Lydia was aware from the start how much worse her life had become after the sudden illness of the Marquis of Evans, but she wasn't prepared for her brother to suddenly become interested in the contents of her travel luggage. The guy couldn't believe that the girl's clothes could weigh so much, even together with the suitcase. So, in just a moment, he dumped everything on the floor to personally make sure that the miss had not stolen anything. Such actions confused Arson the most, because he was not used to seeing the underwear of noble aristocrats. The heroine was always prepared for humiliation from Devon, but this time he turned out to be too cruel. In fact, the guy thought that the lady might have hidden something among her clothes, but he didn't find anything suspicious. His sister's red face made him realize that he had indeed crossed the line in his search and questioning. The Marquise's son was not one to easily admit his guilt, so his apology was not sincere. Lydia would have given a lot for the opportunity to have a proper talk with her brother, but she had to leave. That's why the girl preferred to let this situation slide, just so that Devon wouldn't cancel her trip. In fact, all this time, Lydia was only pretending to be angry and offended by her older brother. But she forgot to tell Arson about her plan, so the guy believed in the sincerity of these emotions. He awkwardly offered his help, as he understood that it would be difficult for Miss to lug around this suitcase. But the heroine would never part with her luggage, because the underwear in it hid one little secret. The whole point was that the girl personally spent several nights sewing in the diamonds. So, if Devon had looked closely, he would have seen jewelry on his sister's clothes. That's why Lydia was in a good mood. Despite the fact that her brother had shamed her quite a bit, her uninhibited behavior greatly embarrassed Arson, who was not ready for this. The lady had no intention of living up to the modest image of a priestess, although she had taken on this role. So she calmly embarrassed her friend, and the knight gradually lost his usual composure. The only thing that saved Edith from embarrassment was that the lady suddenly changed the subject, as she wanted to save her friends. But there was still a fair distance to the quarries, so the guy didn't hope for a quick reunion. He was still surprised that the girl stubbornly followed him, although it was very dangerous. But the desire to save her friends was so strong that Lydia did not doubt her decision for a second. Byron, Nella, and Marie had done so much for her in their past life that they deserved better. So the lady waited impatiently for the carriage to finally take her to the right place. After a few days of travel, Arson met his knights and gallantly introduced them to the girl. Lydia was glad that now their journey promised to become even more reliable and fulfilling. Cedric Raymond generally showed maximum good nature to the lady, since he respected aristocrats. The heroine remembered from her past life that this guy could be trusted with any secret. Her good attitude made the knight so happy that he immediately began to boast to his friends. Only Randall didn't even smile at the girl, although the rest of the assistants were glad to see her. In this guy, the lady immediately recognized the same impudent man who had spoken so rudely to her a few days ago, but she hoped that the overall mood in the team would still remain pleasant. But this did not happen, because Randall thoroughly ruined the life of the Marquise's young daughter. No matter what the girl did, the knight was constantly rude to her, as if he had been harboring a deep grudge for a long time. In the end, even Arson noticed that his subordinate had been behaving extremely strangely the entire time on the road. But Randall felt no remorse at all and continued to offend the young lady. The heroine never found an answer to the question of why this knight allowed himself to constantly offend her. Only Cedric stopped the guy in time, who was being so insolent, because he was not punished. Edith had no idea why the guy was behaving so strangely with the lady, and Lydia couldn't help her friend explain the situation, since it all remained a mystery to her too. But the girl was interested in the fact that the guy for some reason paid attention to this assistant. More than once, the heroine had the feeling that Randall was deliberately standing between her and Arson. This could only mean that every little thing connected with the master was important to the knight. It is quite possible that the guy had previously pushed away girls from Arson who wanted to confess their love to him. Byron did not miss the curious glance of the Marquis's daughter, who had managed to draw several conclusions. The guy had no desire to hear more gossip about himself that was far from reality. But the lady still asked whether there was a deeper connection between Arson and Randall. Even the mere suggestion of this enraged Edith, who hated this kind of relationship. So Miss had to admit her defeat, although it did not help her find answers to the questions. It was only that evening at the hotel that Lydia was able to get a little closer to the truth. Cedric, who was always known for his talkativeness and ability to help by chance, helped her with this. Until the very end, the heroine refused to believe that Randall had reasons for behaving this way. But his friend knew the whole truth about the guy, who had actually suffered a lot throughout his life. He told the girl that many of Arson's assistants had received knighthoods from the Emperor himself. It was at that moment that Cedric acquired the surname Raymond, which became the beginning of his noble family. But Randall was a commoner, so he wasn't given a surname. Only now did the lady realize that that impudent guy was simply hiding his pain and resentment behind spite. But Cedric's story didn't end there, because he remembered how Lydia's first meeting with Randall went. The whole point was that the girl then declared that knights without a surname did not have the right to accompany her. The Marquise's daughter had no idea that she had once uttered such cruel words. She remembered that in the past, she had been a cruel and spoiled aristocrat who often offended others. That's why Lady Evans could well have said something like that, since she was reborn not so long ago. Before, the heroine never noticed how arrogant a bitch she was before. But in the end, she offended the honest knight, and didn't even notice that she did something wrong at that moment. The thought flashed through Lydia's mind that she had been reborn to correct all the mistakes of her past. The girl understood how difficult the task she had set for herself was, but she could not act differently. If it weren't for Cedric, the lady would not have known for a long time why Randall had treated her so badly from the moment they met. And now she was eager to ask forgiveness from the guy she had accidentally offended in the past. But the lady didn't have time to do this, because she ran into a nervous arson in the corridor. It turned out that the guy at that very moment decided to get to the quarries, since it was dark night. Lydia had wanted to save her friends from her past life for so long that she didn't dare put off this opportunity. Meanwhile, in the quarries, Marie was finally tired of the constant and hard work of the prisoners. Nella did her best to support the girl who was carrying a child under her heart, but the red-haired lady understood that she shouldn't rely too much on her good friend. She tried to be strong despite the difficult circumstances they found themselves in. However, at night, Marie was haunted by thoughts that her baby might be born with poor health. If only the girl had such an opportunity, she would do everything to live in good conditions. And at that moment, Lydia came to the camp to pick up the red-haired girl who always supported her. Due to fatigue and a desire to sleep, Marie did not immediately realize that she was being awakened by an unfamiliar female face. Genuine surprise was reflected on the girl's face, because usually no one paid attention to her. Lydia's heart beat joyfully at the sight of her friend not having yet managed to catch the disease, and Marie cheered up at the sight of the bread that the Marquis of Evans' daughter generously shared with her. They couldn't stay in the camp for long, so the heroine immediately told about the escape she had planned. Lydia's face glowed with happiness, because she could finally give freedom to her friend. Even the fact that Marie didn't remember her due to reincarnation didn't upset the happy girl at all. The red-haired lady had wanted to escape from the quarry for so long that she didn't argue. But on the way, she still remembered her friends, whom she would like to take with her. However, this was not necessary, because Arson had already found Byron and Nella, whom he had been looking for so long. Everything worked out perfectly, as Edith chose a good time for the night escape. The guy always had good organizational skills, and now they helped him. So soon the whole company was assembled, and joy overwhelmed the people who were able to reunite. Lydia was even afraid to think about how she would have saved her friends if it weren't for Arson's help. But everything could not continue to go so well, so one person finally noticed the fugitives. But the heroine was absolutely sure that all the guards would now be on the other side of the quarries. But from the direction of the quarries, a guard with a bright lantern was approaching the group. It turned out to be an elderly man, whose face could attract anyone with its kindness. Lydia was the first to recognize Grandfather Robert, who often secretly helped her in her past life. All the prisoners felt relieved that this man would not betray any of them. The lady was so happy to meet her grandfather that she forgot that he was seeing her for the first time in his life. The man was unhappy that some of the prisoners not only did not sleep, but were also making noise. He immediately guessed that these people were planning an escape from the terrible quarries. But Robert had no intention of stopping his friends, as he always felt sorry for these good prisoners. What he cared about most was Marie, who had gotten involved with a bad person in this area. The heroine was unable to leave her grandfather alone when everyone else was planning an escape, so she was the first to suggest that he go with them, leaving the terrible quarries. Only Arson was outraged by this idea, since this was not part of his plans. However, for Lydia, Edith was not an authority, so she continued to pursue her own line. The girl was confident that Robert's presence would greatly help their group in the future. That's why the heroine tried not to miss this opportunity and take her grandfather with her. Besides, everyone else was only glad that the guard had a chance to join them. In fact, deep down, Robert had long wanted to escape, but he couldn't do it alone. So the whole company grew by one person, and the lady took all her friends with her. She felt Arson's angry gaze on her. He was angry because of the girl's disobedience. So for some time, Miss deliberately avoided communicating with the guy she had infuriated. But soon, Arson changed his anger to mercy, since all his loved ones turned out to be completely fine. The heroine was most happy about the fact that one of her plans had finally come to a successful conclusion, so she focused on the back pain from riding the horse for so long. The girl didn't see anything wrong with her complaints, but Arson had a completely different opinion. The guy was becoming increasingly confused by the fact that Lydia did not behave like a priestess, although she accepted her status. In essence, the heroine did not change at all because she promised to dedicate herself to the gods. She enjoyed arguing with Edith, about whom she knew a little more than everyone else in the group. But from time to time, such disputes led to embarrassment, since the lady did not know the limits of her words. And then came another time when a blush covered Arson's cheeks, causing him to turn away. Even Lydia felt awkward after allowing her friend to call her by her first name. So she quickly changed the subject to talk about the mines that were located on the border. Although these were his territories, Edith himself paid no attention to the empty quarries. What bothered him was that the Marquis's daughter again referred to her reincarnation, which gave her information. The gentleman's assistants collected all the materials about this lady, but could not find anything strange. So Arson didn't find an answer to the question of how Lydia knew all these people from the quarry. The only option left was the one about reincarnation, which Evans never tired of reminding us about. But until now, Byron was not ready to believe in something so impossible and strange, while Lydia calmly thought about how those mines on the border would help her get rich. A sudden realization struck Arson, who realized that the girl hated the entire empire. The heroine truly did not want to stay close to people who only caused her pain. Therefore, she did not deny the fact that she would be able to live much more peacefully at the border. Arsène couldn't find the words to support the girl, but he comfortingly covered her with his hood. When the whole company arrived at the hotel, warm food and a set table were already waiting for them. Only now did Nella give in to the emotions that she had been trying to keep inside all this time. She was glad that the young master had grown so much and was able to become a good person. Byron was also happy about the reunion, because they could not even dream of it. The heroine watched the conversations from the sidelines, and a pleasant warmth spread within her. Only Marie had questions about why she, too, was helped to escape from the quarry. This question stumped the heroine, who could not tell the whole truth to her friends. She would like to hide from them the fact that she herself once suffered in the hard quarries. Therefore, Lydia only reported that she owed her life to everyone. Even Robert was not left without gratitude, although he could not remember where he met the lady. What angered Grandpa most was that Lydia needed his help in the mines. The man hoped that his story of working in the quarries would be over, but it was not so. Of course, no one was going to force people to work because of some offense anymore. So a pleasant atmosphere quickly arose at the table, and the lady smiled sincerely at her friends. So she didn't immediately notice that Randall had suddenly left the general tea party and gone outside. During all this time, the Mist did not have time to explain herself to the knight, so she ran after him. As in previous times, the knight remained just as rude to the girl who was of a higher status. He himself understood that he deserved punishment, but he could not get rid of the resentment and humiliation. But Lydia had no intention of verbally hurting the guy she felt sympathy for even more. Randall would never have thought that this girl came to him to apologize. It seemed to him that his behavior only provoked hatred within the young aristocrat. The guy didn't even think that Cedric would tell Lydia about the incident that happened between them. The heroine still blamed herself for not being able to correct her arrogant behavior earlier. She didn't expect her apology to change anything, but she didn't want to leave anything unsaid. The girl was surprised that Randall suddenly stopped communicating with her abruptly during this conversation. It was important for the guy to know why the lady did not need his forgiveness, even though she spoke sincerely. The whole point was that Lydia never intended to be impudent and calculating again in her life. This is exactly what the lady tried to convey to the knight, and she succeeded in reaching his heart. The boy always liked his title, and therefore he tried to behave accordingly. This time, the heroine was lucky, and her conflict was easily resolved with the kind-hearted Randall. From now on, the knight had no questions for Lydia, and he had no intention of offending her any further. Embarrassment overwhelmed the guy, who always valued recognition from others. That's why he accepted the aristocrat's apology, even though she had hurt him before. Arsène, who was afraid of a fight between the two acquaintances, secretly followed this entire conversation. Edith was sure that Lydia would not have been able to resolve this conflict without a quarrel before, so he was ready to separate the girl who attacked the poor guy from his assistants. But after meeting the Marquis's daughter, much began to change in the life of the heir of the Byron family. From the very beginning, he was struck by the fact that the lady somehow knew his real identity and remained silent. Lydia was so eager to get to the quarries, although she could not hear about the identities of the prisoners, and her bright smile was so out of keeping with the arrogant aristocrats that they were restrained. All these little things captured Arsen's heart, although before he had not paid attention to girls. In the end, the guy had to admit the fact that Lydia had really changed a lot during this time, and she no longer resembled that impudent aristocrat who believed that everyone owed her something. Because of all these thoughts, that night, Arsen had a strange dream about some kind of feast with friends. The Marquise of Evans's daughter was one of the main figures at the event and smiled happily. It was she who pulled Edith along with her, who, as usual, tried to stay away. And at that moment, Arsen's heart began to beat joyfully at the thought that he would be able to dance with the lady. The guy's awakening was exciting after everything he accidentally saw in his dream. For a long time, Edith could not come to his senses, trying to shake off this strange obsession. He didn't expect that he wasn't the only one who had a hard time sleeping that night after a long adventure. Byron and Nella also woke up early in the morning, although they did not have time to fully recover their strength. Seeing their happy faces, Arsen felt as if he had never woken up from sleep. Growing up, the boy dreamed many times of being able to talk calmly like this with his loved ones. Only now did he realize that he had never thanked Lydia for her help in finding his relatives. And at that very moment, the lady appeared next to Arsen, as if she were a ray of sunshine that had been remembered. The heroine had been unable to sleep for a long time in her new place, so she was now lethargic and absent-minded. In this form, she again reminded Edith of the cute bunny with pink fur that lived on the border. Of course, the girl noticed the intent gaze of her friend, who said nothing to her. The guy was embarrassed by his thoughts, because all this time he had been trying to keep his distance. However, he couldn't help but thank Lydia for her help, since he needed it so much. The heroine did not expect to hear something like this from Arsen, who was famous for his strictness. But this time, Edith seemed to her an incredibly sweet and kind person, which surprised Miss. She immediately blushed with embarrassment, as she did not know how to accept compliments with dignity. The lady would have preferred that Arsen continued to grumble towards her rather than become soft. So it was difficult for the heroine to contain her emotions, because she herself used Edith's powers. But the guy still believed that they had done each other good services that should be appreciated. In this situation, the best thing Lydia could come up with was to run away in order to get ready for the trip. Arsen didn't stop the girl, although he still didn't understand whether she accepted his gratitude. He didn't have time to ask anything else, because the heroine demonstrated miraculous running speed. Only in this way did the girl save herself from the embarrassment that suddenly overwhelmed her. Miss had a hard time keeping her composure when it came to being thanked for her services. Due to the hasty preparations, the entire company soon set off on the road again. The former prisoners tried to behave quietly, as they had to pass through security. Arsen put Milan in as a coachman, because the boy was a good negotiator. The knight calmly accepted any position, if it did not tarnish his honor in any way. The heroine had something to offer her friend, so that they could pass the checkpoint without any problems. So the girl shared the coins with him, because the success of their journey was important to her. But not everything was so simple, because along with the money, the lady handed over the Evans family's gold button. She was sure that Richard knew nothing about the quarries, so she tried to get his attention. Lydia didn't want to think about the fact that it was Devon who had sent her to the mines in her past life. But there were no other options, so the lady planned to behave much more carefully. Meanwhile, at the Evans estate, the Marquis's eldest son was going mad with rage that was eating him up from the inside. He tried his best to hide the fact that Lydia had become a priestess, and Richard spread the rumors. This was not to the advantage of Devon, who still hoped for his sister's marriage to the wealthy Arsen. That's why the boy got so angry when the Emperor threw all his efforts down the drain. He was not the type of person to leave it like that, so he called an assistant to make a request. Devon urgently needed to meet Giselle, and only a servant could deliver the invitation to her. So, a few hours later, the Emperor's wife visited the Evans family's estate. The girl saw nothing wrong with the rumors about Lydia that quickly spread throughout the empire. But the guy had a different opinion, as he wanted a rich and influential future for himself. That's why he needed Giselle's support, who wanted to become part of the Evans family. But Devon didn't expect the girl to suddenly start talking about his personal life, which remained empty. The Emperor's wife could not understand why Devon did not try to find a loved one. Evans immediately guessed that behind the lady's beautiful words was hidden an attempt to meddle in other people's business. He was old enough to decide for himself whether to get together with someone or not. Devon had become good at spotting people who wanted something from him because of his status, so the guy began to masterfully find out the truth that Giselle desperately hid. And the girl had an offering for Evans as a second child, if he was a boy. The offer was too good for Devon, who might not marry at all. Meanwhile, the heroine and her company had almost reached her father's domain, where he himself was located. The girl could hardly stand on her feet after such a long journey, but she tried to hold on. True, her strength still failed her, but at the right moment, Randall caught the young aristocrat in time. After their conversation, the guy became soft and reserved, and always helped the lady at the right time. So Lydia's life became much easier, since all the arguments with the knight finally ended. The only thing that made things more difficult for the lady was the constant muscle pain, so she needed rest. So the heroine even thought about continuing her further journey in a carriage. Arsène, who was watching the girl from the side, caught himself thinking that he would like to catch her himself. The guy was unable to understand why he had such desires towards the lady, but his whole consciousness was filled with worries about Lydia, who was trying to look good. He understood that the lady was probably very tired, although she continued to smile at everyone around her. His behavior did not escape Cedric, who could not remain silent near the young master. The guy honestly warned that it was impossible to secretly follow girls like that. Of course, Arsène began to deny this, although he was indeed guilty of surveillance. The knight's aim was only to embarrass the master, so he quickly left him alone. And at that very moment, Lydia turned to Edith, not even suspecting his thoughts. Arsène didn't even have time to tidy himself up, and his red face betrayed his embarrassment. The heroine wanted to take a little look around the area before setting off on her way again. The lady needed help in a difficult matter that could save his father. She had already learned in the labor camp in her past life how to help the Marquise, who was unconscious. And to do this, the girl only needed to search the flower fields on the way to her father. Only with their help was the heroine able to help Carl Evans, who had been ill for a long time. The secret was that a simple decoction of yellow dandelions helped with my father's illness. Lydia was glad that her knowledge from her past life came in handy so quickly in this one. Until the very end, Arsène did not believe that the lady could really help her father with just tea. But the aristocrat acted so confidently that he had no questions for her. If it weren't for the information from the past, the girl would never have figured out how to solve everything. And now she carefully gave the Marquis tea in the hope that he would soon open his eyes. And the long-awaited miracle finally happened, as Carl came to his senses after a long time. When she saw her healthy father, the heroine could not contain her emotions, as she missed him very much. She threw herself into the Marquis's arms, completely forgetting that he was still physically weak. Lydia would not have survived if she had not tried to use her success to her advantage, so she immediately began to cry even louder, so that Carl would suspect something was wrong with her affairs. Only after this did the lady confess that Richard had broken off his engagement with her for Giselle. Of course, Miss knew that Carl would not be able to ignore this information. That's why she enthusiastically pretended to be heartbroken by her ex-husband's infidelity. The Marquis clearly didn't expect Richard to do this to his daughter, as he considered him a good guy. What interested him most was what Devon, as Lydia's older brother, would do in this situation, and the heroine reported with glee that the guy only supported her decision to divorce. But the Marquis didn't even know about all this, since he was unconscious due to illness. The most frightening thing was that even the Marquis's butler was not aware of all these details. This is how Lydia easily earned the wrath of her father, who did not like it when things were done without his knowledge. She tried to convince the man that it was necessary to hide his knowledge from others for now. But all this was only to further frame the brother who bought the coffin for his father. This news hit the Marquis the hardest, as he had trusted his son to govern all his life. And now he realized that he made a big mistake when he didn't give power to his daughter as well. Carl had just come to his senses, and so much unpleasant news had already fallen upon him. It was precisely this state of affairs that Lydia was striving for in her father, although she wished him a speedy recovery. But the girl could not deal with the offenders on her own, so she resorted to the Marquise's help. She knew how much her father loved his son all this time, since he was his only heir. But now all this information will definitely cause a quarrel between Carl and Devon, which will play into Lydia's hands. While the Marquise was coming to his senses, the heroine did not waste time and rested with the pleasant Marie. On one of these walks, they accidentally met Arsène and Cedric, who were out on business. The knight was the first to notice the girls, as he always loved to chat between tasks. He was surprised at how quickly the two ladies became friends with each other in such a situation. It turned out that Lydia and Marie even created their own club while they were shopping. It was an organization for those who were also very unlucky in love and did not want to fall in love. For some reason, Arsène was unpleasant to hear that Lydia had actually observed a vow of celibacy. Personally, the guy believed that the girl could easily find a good gentleman for herself. Once again, the heroine noticed Edith's attentive gaze, which did not tell her anything. At that moment, Arsène thought that the lady should simply change her tastes, so he was not prepared for Lydia to personally approach him in the midst of such confusing thoughts. The only thing that saved the guy was that they had to go to the marquee together in a couple of minutes. Arsène took the opportunity to confess his admiration for the lady. The heroine herself was delighted that her dandelion recipe worked on her father. She was ready for even greater achievements after everything had worked out so well. But the lady was still troubled by the question of whether Arsène now believed in her recent rebirth. And now the guy boldly declared that if he didn't believe, he wouldn't have helped the girl in anything. Although he initially did not intend to trust her, too many factors pointed to reincarnation. In any case, the lady was glad that she was able to achieve recognition from such a stubborn aristocrat. Even as they approached the Marquise's office, they both heard the angrily indignant voice of the ruler of the Evans family. Lydia peered inside cautiously, worried that she, too, might experience some of her father's emotions. But it turned out that the man was only angry at his son because he bought for him not only a coffin, but also a monument with an inscription. What upset Carl most was the behavior of Giselle, whom he accepted as his own daughter. Even the loyal butler was dissatisfied with the behavior of the girl who brazenly took Lydia's place. The heroine understood the Marquise's emotions, but she would not want his anger to be directed only at Giselle. So she reminded her father that the lady would not have succeeded without the support of Richard and Devon. This led to the man's even stronger desire to resolve all issues as quickly as possible. The heroine did not expect that her father would go to Devon's estate so soon to punish him. She was still afraid that the Marquise, who had recently recovered, would again fail in health. But Carl was not the kind of person who was willing to just sit still while things were happening behind his back. So the heroine had no choice but to support her father, who was eager to fight. The Marquise was delighted with how wise and kind his daughter had grown without his supervision. He showered the girl with compliments, although she knew that she did not do everything just for her father. But this meeting went so well that the lady had almost no problems with Richard and Devon. When the meeting with her father ended, she was finally convinced that he would sort everything out well. The lady remembered that in the past, Carl had helped Richard only because he wanted to marry his daughter to him. And in the end, the guy traded Lydia for Giselle, which the recovered head of the Evans family would never have approved of. That is why the heroine could allow herself to think and act relaxedly in the near future. Looking at such a happy Lydia, Arsène himself seemed to become happier, but he was tormented by the question of what the girl planned to do next, once all the issues were resolved. The heroine did not expect that the guy would want her to stay with him in this estate. She had never considered his opinion before, and by chance she was following the same path. Arsène realized too late how strange his question sounded in light of the recent circumstances. It was not surprising that Lydia thought that Edith was worried about her secret, which she knew. The aristocrat had no answer to all these suspicions, because he had driven himself into a trap. It turned out that the heroine wanted to go to Arsène's territory, although she did not intend to live on his estate. For the first time, the lady decided to take advantage of her priestess status, since there was also a temple on the border. It was from the talkative Cedric that Miss learned all the details, so she came up with the idea of living in that place. Arsène could not allow the girl to do something like this, since that temple had been empty for many years. But this did not frighten the heroine, who did not want to cause Edith any problems. Arson was sure that the girl remained so frivolous because she did not know about all the danger. However, the very next day, Lydia was ready to set off on another journey. But this time, Edith asked the lady to ride in the carriage so that nothing would happen to her on the way. The heroine was so exhausted from her previous trips that she didn't even argue with the aristocrat, although she could not understand what was so dangerous about an ordinary trip to the border. Miss had heard more than once about the monsters that lived right on the way to the possessions of young Arson. These starving monsters periodically attacked those who tried to pass by their domain. The lady remembered that since ancient times, many knights protected people from the attacks of monsters, but she didn't believe that she would actually stumble upon one of these creatures because they were far away. So the journey promised to be calm and relaxing for the girl sitting in the carriage. But fate decreed otherwise. As soon the entire carriage shook violently, screams were heard from outside the carriage, announcing the appearance of a terrible monster. Just when Lydia wanted to rest, life threw her another unpleasant surprise. The collision with the monster nearly caused the carriage to overturn, and the girls ended up on the floor. The heroine barely managed to help Nella get out of the carriage, which could no longer provide protection for them. But caring for the woman didn't work in the lady's favor, because she ended up attracting the attention of a terrible monster. As soon as Lydia noticed the approaching threat, her whole body froze in insane fear. In this situation, Miss would not have been able to help herself in any way, although more than anything in the world, she did not want to die. But the Marquise's daughter was lucky, and Arsène came to the rescue in time, preventing her death. Tears of gratitude gushed from the lady's eyes, despite the fact that her entire face was stained with the monster's blood. The monster had not yet been dealt with, so Edith had no time to help Lydia escape. Although she was very scared, the heroine watched the confident battle of the young aristocrat until the very end. Only now did she realize that it was not for nothing that he was called the best swordsman in the Empire, because the guy was not afraid. Thanks to the skillful actions of Arson and his assistants, no one in the group of friends was hurt. The worst hit was Lydia, who was covered from head to toe in the blood of the huge monster. But the girl didn't even think about being sad, because she could soon wash her clothes in the river. This is exactly what the girl did a couple of hours later, when the whole group had dealt with the monster. Marie joined the Marquise's daughter because she wanted to help her with dressing and washing clothes. It turned out that not only girls came to the river, since this place was the only clean one. The knights also decided to cleanse themselves of the blood that generously splashed them from head to toe. Only Marie dared to wave to the boys, despite the fact that they were almost naked. But Lydia was embarrassed by such circumstances, because she was not used to changing clothes in company. But the red-haired lady quickly persuaded the heroine to at least take a little look at the knight's beautiful muscles. The Marquise's daughter resisted this decision to the last, but something made her change her mind. The whole point was that the girl was interested in Arson's pumped-up body, who was also washing himself. The lady had no idea that the guy was so well built, because it was unclear what he was wearing. This made Lydia freeze in place with curiosity as she was captured by a foreign body. No matter how hard the heroine tried, she couldn't tear her curious gaze away from Arson. Marie didn't miss the opportunity to laugh at her friend who gave in to her feelings. In the end, all the heroine's attempts to come to her senses finally fell apart before such persuasion. Surprisingly, the girl quickly resigned herself to the fact that she would be watching handsome guys. Delighted that Lydia accepted her idea, Marie began to find out who was the coolest. From the outside, it might have seemed that the knights did not hear the conversation of the two aristocrats nearby. But in reality, they pricked up their ears because they also wanted to know the truth about themselves. The guys were always happy to hear about their exploits and beautiful bodies after their efforts, so each of them began to pose for the ladies, just so that they would choose him as the best. Only Arson did not want to take part in this competition, as he considered it something stupid. But deep down, he also wanted to know if Lydia would choose him in this argument. So Edith, no less than everyone else, strained his attention, wanting to hear the girl's answer, while the heroine didn't even suspect that her choice was so important for all the guys. In the end, the girls agreed that Cedric's body looked better than that of the other knights. And it so happened that none of the guys who listened attentively expected this choice. Only Raymond beamed with happiness, as he always worked hard for his body. But the other knights were perplexed, because they did not consider themselves much worse than Cedric. This small dispute led to many knights feeling competition. The most painful thing to hear this truth was for Arsène, who had expected a different result. He could not explain to himself why the lady was looking so intently at his body then. Edith consoled himself only with the thought that attracting someone's attention and making them fall in love were two different things. As a result, the young man himself did not notice how he once again began to think about his relationship with Lydia. The commander was saved from such thoughts by a joyful Cedric, whose mood suddenly improved after hearing what he had heard. But it turned out that Raymond only made the situation worse by talking about his beautiful body again. But it was already difficult for Arsène to admit the defeat that came so quickly for him. In fact, Cedric wasn't trying to offend anyone with his boasting. He was just happy with his success. But for some reason, when it came to Lydia, Edith could no longer maintain his former calm. But he had to pretend that everything was fine in order to protect the temporary camp from the monsters. When all the business was finished, the guy finally visited Nella, who had suffered in the commotion. He was very worried about the woman, who was no longer in the best health due to her age. But Arsène didn't expect that Nella herself was much more worried about Lydia, who was next to her. She herself barely recovered after falling in the carriage, something she was not at all prepared for. The woman forever remembered how the Marquise's daughter hugged her, trying to protect her from the monster. The feeling of gratitude towards this girl increasingly haunted Edith, no matter how much he denied it. But Lydia's smile captivated the guy, and her kind character seemed ideal for young ladies to him. So, even without Nella's request, he was going to keep an eye on the girl who was facing danger. Arsène still hasn't given up hope that Lydia will change her mind about living in the temple all alone. So he wanted to talk to the Marquis's daughter again, and just then he noticed her not far from the tents. At this moment, Lydia received information from Cedric that she would need to spend the night with Edith. It turned out that all the knights were worried about the girl's safety, so they proposed this solution. Lie down, and she herself understood that Arsène was the best option for her as a knight protection. Besides, even Raymond believed that the gentleman would not do anything bad to the lady, since he always remains a gentleman. In fact, the heroine had time to personally verify that Arsène could be trusted in such things. But for Cedric, Edith's gallant behavior with the girls seemed stupid and unreasonable. Lydia instantly remembered these phrases from the night, since no one had described Arsène from such a side before. And now, Edith had no way to make the lady think differently about him. The heroine herself noticed that, for some reason, Arsène did not pay attention to the ladies, as if he was afraid to talk to them. In response, the guy explained that he simply never had any desire or interest in anything like that. As he suspected, all his words brought no result, and Lydia remained with her opinion. After hearing this, she finally stopped being afraid to stay close to her friend. So the Marquis's daughter was the first to slip into the tent to prepare for a night's rest in it. Arsène had no doubt that the lady did not believe his personal reluctance to communicate with other ladies. Lydia greeted this situation with laughter until the very end, since she hadn't joked for a long time. But in reality, she was genuinely interested in knowing why Edith had continued to ignore aristocrats. And the lady hit the nail on the head, because the guy really did have a reason for acting this way. He was afraid that the truth about his lineage would be revealed, and no girl would want to stay with him. That's partly why Arsène was so keen on communicating with the only lady who knew the truth about him. Suddenly, the heroine confessed that her brother also had one little secret about why he didn't get married. Lydia knew perfectly well that the guy would be interested in her words, so she deliberately played with his emotions. She approached Edith conspiratorially, pleased with how attentive he was to her words. But in reality, the girl had no intention of revealing her brother's important secret so easily. But even she understood how cruel it was to not satisfy the curiosity of an acquaintance. The reason was that the lady herself was not very pleased to remember the sad past. Many years ago, before her death, the Marquise asked her daughter to be sure to give birth to several sons at once, and the heroine had to give one of them to her older brother, although she did not understand why this was necessary. At that moment, the mother did not reveal the details to her daughter, but made her promise to do so. Only after some time did Lydia find an answer for herself, which immediately plunged her into real shock. And now Arsène was no less surprised, and quickly realized what the problem was. Who would have thought that Devon would have problems with infertility since childhood, even though he was the heir? Until now, the heroine was upset by the fact that her mother, until her death, only worried about her son. So she was no longer going to keep her older brother's terrible secret a secret. Edith clearly didn't expect this turn of events, but he managed to suppress a surprised expression. For him, Devon could still be the heir to the family line, even despite his incurable infertility. But Lydia knew her grumpy and stubborn father too well, so she had a different opinion. Edith could never have understood how important it was to Kyle that someone of his own blood take his place. Usually, the guy preferred not to interfere in the affairs of other families, because he had enough problems of his own. Besides, Lydia wasn't going to reveal to the guy absolutely all the secrets and plans that concerned her future. So Arson good-naturedly changed the conversation to whether the girl was really going to live in the temple alone. He still wanted to convince Lydia to come and live on his estate, where she would not disturb anyone. But the heroine was so attached to her status as a priestess that she did not want to change her decision. No matter how hard Arson tried to scare the girl with stories about monsters, it was all useless. Lady Evans asked her friend about the monsters with interest, as if she wanted to meet them. But in reality, she was carefully thinking about how she could confront the monsters from the temple alone. The last thing Arson expected was that the girl would think about learning fencing. He thought that if he scared the lady a little, she would immediately agree to his lucrative offer. But Lydia's stubbornness and desire for independence turned out to be much stronger than Edith had expected. And now the heroine is inspired by the idea of taking a few self-defense lessons. Knowing the girl's character, the guy no longer hoped that he would ever be able to convince her otherwise. At the same time, the lady herself behaved as if she had no intention of resting at all before the difficult trip. But after just a couple of minutes, she was fast asleep, so Arson envied her ability to fall asleep. After the monster's attack, the guy was afraid to leave the girl alone, but he also didn't dare disturb her sleep. The young gentleman had rarely had time to be alone with his thoughts lately. But before, Edith so loved to enjoy the company of the sword, which would never betray him or deceive him. He could not have imagined that this beautiful girl would be so lively and resilient in all situations. In the end, the guy barely managed to save Lydia at one point, and was afraid that he wouldn't make it in time next time. Suddenly, Arson heard the girl moaning anxiously in her sleep, as if she was dreaming something bad. He still didn't want to wake Lydia from her sleep, since she needed to gain enough strength. But the heroine really did have a nightmare about her past, when she was cruelly betrayed by Richard. The Emperor showed no pity for the girl who had once been his first wife. He only helped the lady by sparing her the death penalty after attempting to kill the pregnant Giselle. But Richard was not going to show any more indulgences, because Miss had helped him only once. At the end of this conversation, the guy left so quickly, as if they had never been close to each other. At that moment, such behavior of the ex-husband broke the heart of the girl who was abandoned into pieces. And now, when the heroine remembered the past, she again felt sad to relive everything all over again. Only recently did she realize that the guy never had feelings for her, but only used her. But this did not stop the girl's heart from aching every time she remembered her husband's betrayal. The heroine was no longer going to tolerate the fact that Richard had made her useless and unwanted. After her rebirth, the lady gained the courage to take revenge on each of her offenders. Lydia didn't know that in her sleep she was still sadly calling out to Richard, begging him not to leave her. These were the words that Arson heard, hoping that the lady had long forgotten her ex-husband. So the guy felt bad when he realized that the girl was lying not only to him, but also to herself. In theory, he shouldn't have felt anything towards the Marquis's daughter, whom he was simply accompanying on her journey. But the more Edith communicated with Lydia, the more difficult it was for him to distance himself from his own emotions. At this moment, Devon also experienced mood swings when he learned about his father's arrival. But the guy didn't even have time to hide the coffin, which stood in the middle of one of the rooms in the estate. Meanwhile, Carl actually reached the house where his son was staying, although he was not feeling very well. The heir of the Evans family had always been good at hiding his emotions, so he smiled easily at his father. But the Marquis was not so joyful, because he remembered all of his son's misdeeds. The very first glance at his father told the boy that he was in deep trouble and would hardly be able to get out calmly. All because Carl was interested in how the young man dared to adopt Giselle without his knowledge. The boy would never have thought that the conversation with his father would begin with such an unpleasant topic. It was only by a miracle that he managed to postpone the conversation for a while, under the pretext that the Marquise needed peace. But the young man understood perfectly well that his cunning manipulations would not last long, so he would have to speak. He was at least glad that the assistants had managed to carry out the coffin that the boy had bought for his father. Despite his long illness, Carl looked like a man ready for any difficulties. But Devon didn't have time to mentally prepare for such a difficult conversation with his father about Giselle. Until the very end, the Marquis hoped that his son would support his daughter. But this did not happen. So it was no surprise that Carl exploded with rage, since he had always had poor control over his emotions. The man couldn't believe that between the two sides, Devon hadn't helped his dear Lydia in any way. The guy had no arguments in his favor, since it was truly beneficial for him to accept the Emperor's offer. Unlike him, the Marquise would not have been interested in anything Richard said, whom he no longer respected. But Devon was too easily swayed by the title of Duke that his husband Giselle had promised him. The young man did not expect that even to this, his father's reaction would be as furious as to everything else. No matter what his son said in his defense, Carl no longer believed that he was not destroying their family. Meanwhile, the heroine successfully reached Edith's territory and looked around in surprise. She didn't expect there to be so much devastation around, because Arsene always tried to help his people. Only Cedric explained to the girl that knights were not always able to protect in the absence of their master. Everyone understood perfectly well how important Arsene's presence was in his territories. This made Lydia feel even more grateful to the guy who stayed late because of her. The lady could not have imagined that Edith had humbly carried so much responsibility on himself since childhood. In his territories, he was a hero for every resident, because he could solve any problem. That's why the heroine was pleased to know that she helped reunite her friends. The beginning of her grand plan had been laid, and the girl already felt happier than in the past. Part of the lady was sad because of how much more needed to be done to finally become free. While Arsene was distracted, Lydia returned to her idea that she would live in a temple nearby. But this time, for some reason, Cedric did not want to personally help the Marquis's daughter, although he had time. But the boy still dumped this task on Randall, although the knight was busy helping his master. The heroine still felt awkward in the company of this guy, but she wouldn't have found her way on her own. Randall led the girl to the right place so quickly, as if it wasn't located several kilometers away. Already outside, the heroine was horrified by the state of the temple, which looked long abandoned. The lady's last hope for his normal condition quickly left her when she noticed the stuck door. In the end, Miss had to resort to Randall's help, because only he could figure out the entrance. Lydia obediently moved away so that the guy had enough space, and he opened the doors. But the heroine didn't expect that the knight wouldn't waste his time and would simply break off a dry piece of wood. Personally, she preferred more calm methods, but she didn't say anything to the guy. Instead, the girl tenderly thanked him for his help, as she could hardly have managed it on her own. Randall hadn't asked Lydia for support all this time, even though he still really needed it. But the guy continued to stubbornly hide the fact that he liked the praise from the young aristocrat. The lady had long understood all the peculiarities of the knight's behavior, so she considered him very nice. While the heroine was settling into the temple, Arsene had no time to visit her. Only from Cedric did he learn all the details about how things were going with the Marquise's young daughter. This is all because during his absence from the estate, he had accumulated a whole pile of paperwork. So Arsene had to rely solely on Raymond's honesty when it came to news. It was from him that he learned that all this time, Randall had been visiting the temple with Lydia almost every day. But Edith knew better than anyone that the guy didn't believe in God at all, even though he visited the girl. In the end, the heir of the Byron family also could not stand it, and nevertheless went to the temple, despite his affairs. Lydia greeted the guy with a surprised expression on her face, as she had not expected him so early. But Arsene, who had already become attached to the girl, was unable to bear the separation any longer. That's why he was so desperate to get to the lady, even though he had been too busy lately. To Arsene's surprise, the temple was significantly different from how he remembered it a few days ago. So the guy sincerely praised the Marquise's daughter for the work she had done, because she had tried hard. But in fact, the changes to the temple were not only the work of Lydia, who lived here permanently. Randall came to her every day, and it was through his hands that many of the shortcomings were corrected. When the heroine asked why the guy visited her so often, he lied that it was the master's order. Because of this little lie, the girl now believed that Arson was constantly keeping an eye on her. She was once again convinced of how awkward Edith was in communicating with aristocrats. Lydia herself was not shy about confessing her feelings or asking for help. And right now, she needed to collect lavender in the forest, to plant near the temple as its symbol. Arson didn't even think of letting the lady go to such an event alone, although she could have handled it. But the forest still remained a dangerous territory, even though Edith personally drove away all the monsters nearby. But, knowing Lydia, the guy couldn't help but follow her journey to ensure that everything ended well. The young man had no doubt that without his help, the lady would have gone into the forest on her own. And he hit the nail on the head, because these were exactly the thoughts that were going through the head of the heroine who needed lavender. But Arson's company only made the search for the plant more enjoyable, as the guy was an interesting conversationalist. Besides, he remained a gentleman, although the girl did not expect such help. But many places in the forest were difficult to traverse for the aristocrats who always lived on estates. Thanks to Arson, the heroine soon achieved her goal, which made her incredibly happy. This made the girl completely forget about safety, and therefore she ran forward all alone. But a moment later, Lydia turned back sharply, because she saw something frightening for herself. The lady noticed a slight movement in the bushes, and her imagination immediately drew a monster in that place. Only Arson realized that it wasn't the real monster that was getting closer. As the girl screamed, a pink hare suddenly jumped out into the clearing in front of them, looking hostile. To her surprise, the heroine immediately remembered that Arson had once compared her to a similar animal. In fact, the guy meant its winter version, when the rabbit grew soft fur. But he didn't want to waste time explaining, so he quickly changed the subject to flowers. As a result of his conversation with the girl, Arson almost forgot why he had visited her in the first place. As Edith feared, Lydia had also encountered the mercenaries who had recently begun roaming the city. The lady didn't expect that those guys would be spies sent on behalf of the emperor himself. This only meant that all the escaped prisoners were in danger, as they could be recognized. In general, Arson wanted to force the mercenaries to leave his territory under any pretext, but the lady was sure that it would be better if those guys made the decision to leave on their own. And to do this, they had to give the mercenaries what they had come for on the emperor's orders. Lydia knew that she should pretend that she was running after Arson, and he was constantly pushing her away. But the gentleman was not ready for such acting, since he did not believe in its success. But the heroine has already come up with a plan, and now no one can stop her on the way to its implementation. She was sure that the emperor would be afraid to take her from the border, because then rumors would spread among the people. Richard's position was already precarious, as he had taken the throne as a result of a coup d'état. Moreover, many aristocrats did not approve of the fact that the ruler quickly changed his wife. That's why Lydia had no doubt that she would be able to deceive her ex-husband. In the end, the guy had no choice but to agree to the girl's crazy idea. He had already become accustomed to the fact that it was useless to dissuade a lady if she had clung to some idea. Therefore, Arson wisely decided that it would be better for him to support Miss and look after her. The heroine liked the fact that this time Arson didn't even try to argue with her, but Edith couldn't help but mention that it would be better for the girl to live on his estate. He didn't take into account that then rumors about their closeness could anger the emperor even more. That's why the heroine tried to act distant, as if Arson didn't accept her feelings. Lydia believed that the guy would not do her any harm, since he did not know how to communicate with girls. Their conversation ended because the active lady was distracted by another field of flowers. While she ran a short distance away, Arson absent-mindedly watched the girl who occupied all his thoughts. He sincerely could not understand why Richard spoke so badly about his ex-wife in the form of Lydia. Personally, it seemed to Arsène that the Marquis's daughter could make anyone fall in love with her with that smile. Gradually, Edith began to develop feelings for the girl, although he did not admit it to himself. While the guy was thinking about her, the heroine couldn't get his recent words out of her head. And without prompting from Arson, she was not going to act half-heartedly in such important plans. But at that moment, the heroine had no idea that Edith was genuinely not against spending time with her. However, from now on, only Lydia had to run after Arson, and he had to hide his kindness. Even now, the guy was not sure that he could cope with such a difficult and unusual task. But the lady was adamant, as it was important for her to create the right impression for the mercenaries. What surprised the young man most was that all this time, Randall had been coming to the girl on his behalf. And now, Lydia mistakenly believed that this was how Arson tried to take care of her, even from a distance. That's why the heroine smiled tenderly at her friend, as a sincere expression of gratitude for his help. Edith could well have explained that he had not actually given the knight any orders. But for some reason, the guy couldn't refuse the gratitude that he received by mistake. Only in the evening did Arsene remember that he had promised Cedric to return to the estate before dinner. But, although the gentleman had too much to do, he did not regret spending time on Lydia. It seemed to him that the lady was worthy of every minute that he spent in her company today. Now the heroine had to pretend that she had had feelings for Arsene for a long time. But Edith had to gather all her willpower into a fist in order to push the lady away during her seduction. The next morning, unpleasant memories of the past suddenly visited the Marquise's young daughter. One day at the ball, the girl couldn't take it anymore and ran away, since her mother had recently died. It was at that moment that she first met Richard, who showed kindness and affection to Lydia. Then the heroine needed any person who could console her in such terrible grief. And in the face of the unknown young man, the girl saw the very recognition that she sorely needed. That's why she boldly showed tears to a guy she barely knew who attracted her with his beauty. At that time, Neville did not yet have status, so he was drawn to ladies who were more famous than him. And it was Lady Evans who crossed his path, although the guy didn't care who he was seducing. At that moment, Richard said so many kind words to the girl that she remembered them for the rest of her life. Lydia's heart sank as feelings for this nice man began to grow inside her. But the heroine remembered very well that her life only got worse because of Richard. No lady would ever want to experience such a sad ending because of some guy again, so she constantly tried to throw out of her head the memories of the past, which only got in the way. Tomorrow, the heroine planned to prove to everyone around her that she was crazy about the heir of the Byron family. But the streets greeted the girl with discontent because something unpleasant had happened. Previously, the lady was not privy to Arsen's affairs, and therefore did not understand what was happening around her. It turned out that the nearest village had again sold food to the border, at several times the price. Even the wise and skillful Milan was unable to cope with such a financial problem. Everyone knew that transporting food through monster territory was a dangerous business. That's why border residents had to put up with inflated prices from traders. What angered the heroine most was that those people were selling everything except the usual grains for planting food. The knight did not know for sure whether this Count Vonda, who ruled the neighboring lands, was known about. But Lydia was alarmed by the fact that the Count's chief assistant was definitely aware of all these matters. This is how the idea of coming to County Wanda as Lady Evans was born in the heroine's head. But the girl did not expect that Arsene would personally volunteer to accompany her on the journey. It seemed to her that the guy had a lot of worries lately, because they hardly saw each other. Edith explained his presence by saying that he had promised the Marquis of Evans to look after his daughter. But the lady took so many guards with her that she completely stopped being afraid of the huge monsters from the forest. Arsene couldn't help but shudder when he heard that Randall also wanted to go with them. He remembered well the moment when the girl invited the knights to go with her to the Count. Then each of the assistants was impressed that he could provide the lady with a good service. And Randall was one of those guys who was desperate to go on a trip together. Arsene could not have imagined that Lydia was so popular among his close associates. Of course, Edith could not take all the knights with him at once, since the border needed to be guarded. He pointed his finger deliberately past Randall, who was already hanging around Lydia a lot. Arsene did not yet suspect that at that moment he was driven not by cold calculation, but by ordinary jealousy. And now the guy was worried that he had treated one of his best assistants too harshly. Due to his anxiety, Edith completely forgot that he was the ruler of the lands and made all the decisions himself. Arsene was suddenly saved from his heavy thoughts by Lydia, who started talking about the shopping list. The girl had not been able to find this information in advance, so she was still interested in getting it. But she didn't expect that the shopping list after the monster attack would be so huge. Because of this, Lydia was once again glad of her foresight at the estate. Now it was Arsene's turn to be surprised, as he didn't know that the lady had stolen his father's wealth. All this time, the diamonds were next to the girl, and she carefully guarded them from everyone. But the heroine's surprises did not end there, because she showed only a small part of her wealth. Edith was not prepared for Lydia to suddenly reach into her travel suitcase, but the guy was even more embarrassed by the fact that the girl openly showed him her underwear. The Marquise's daughter could not help but boast about how well she had come up with the idea of hiding these treasures from her brother. Only now did the guy realize why the miss periodically looked so tired after the night. That's why he offered to help Lydia in this matter, although she didn't even count on such a thing. In fact, the heroine really could use some rest, so her arguments with her friend were short-lived. And after just a couple of minutes, the girl was sleeping so soundly that only the appearance of a monster could wake her up. While Arson carefully touched the women's underwear, taking out diamonds from it, the understanding that he was doing something wrong constantly haunted the guy. But by the time they arrived in County Vaughan, Edith had removed all the diamonds from Lydia's underwear. The heroine was immediately impressed by the scale of this small town, which looked beautiful. They just crossed a forest with monsters, and the people's standard of living changed so much. But the lady had no time to think about such details, since her plan was awaiting immediate implementation. And Lydia decided to start her performance with the stores, where she would leave a whole bunch of money. She came to this city as the spoiled daughter of a marquise and was going to show herself off to everyone. According to the lady's plan, she will start by spending money as if she doesn't know its value at all. Then, as expected, many merchants will start to deceive the girl in order to get more coins, and at the most opportune moment, the heroine planned to explode with rage because she was being deceived. It wasn't just for nothing that mistook Arson with her. She wanted to feign love for him right on the streets. While Milan was skilled at finding the richest shops that were in the city, and now it was Lydia's turn to shine, which she had not done before, since she had changed after her rebirth. The lady began her game right away, but Arson was not prepared for what the girl would demand of him. The guy found it strange that he needed to angrily grumble at every simple action of hers, but the heroine needed Edith to successfully pretend that he was not interested in her at all. But this plan failed at the very beginning, since the guy did not understand how to act. As soon as they entered the expensive store, the saleswoman personally greeted the first guests of the day. She immediately recognized the girl as a priestess, since rumors about Lydia had spread throughout the empire. So the madam didn't understand what such a person was doing in her expensive and respectable clothing store. Given her status, the heroine had no need to choose luxurious dresses and outfits. But this time, Lydia acted as if she had no idea about the rules for living as a priestess. The saleswoman quickly adapted to the guest's manner, which struck her as spoiled. The lady easily pretended to be outraged by the temple for providing her with only one outfit, so the madam had to urgently call assistance to satisfy all the lady's desires. The marquise's daughter deliberately rejected all the fabrics offered until she found the most expensive one. The knights watched the girl in silence, although they did not understand what game she was playing in the store. But the saleswoman supported every decision of the guest, since she smelled like money to her. The woman kept suggesting different elements to the outfits, which only made them more expensive. But Lydia silently tolerated this behavior, since such deception only played into her hands. This is how the heroine, for the first time in her life, agreed to a dress that cost more than the estate. The madam treated her rich guest with such reverence that she promised to sew all the outfits within a week. But she was interested in why Lydia had been without a maid nearby all this time. The heroine immediately frowned, pretending that this question was too impudent for her. The woman did not expect that the guest would refuse the servant because of her status as a priestess in the temple. It was clear to everyone that the nuns didn't need such expensive outfits, but Lydia skillfully managed the situation. Arson was surprised by how much the girl resembled a spoiled child who went to church. And now, Lydia continued to be indignant about the fact that she didn't need maids at all. Naturally, the heroine turned to Arson for payment, to whom she had given a lot of diamonds in advance. And the guy played his part beautifully when he put those very same jewels on the counter. The saleswoman couldn't believe her eyes when she was paid such a sum for several dresses. But Lydia wasn't going to waste time on trifles, since the rumors about her wealth and spoiledness were important to her. But all this led to the fact that within a couple of hours, every merchant was hunting for the girl. So the heroine was pretty tired of visiting countless stores that made her head spin. Only Arson silently perceived everything that was happening, since he was well prepared physically. The girl decided to take advantage of this, pretending to be very tired from constant walking. She deliberately sat down on the ground and began to complain so that everyone would hear about her hysteria. The heroine planned that Edith would rudely refuse help, and she would have to do everything herself. But suddenly, the guy picked up the lady in his arms, as if it was nothing for him to do. Arsene's face reflected the sincere emotions that overwhelmed him at the sight of the lady. This was not at all the result that the young daughter of the Marquise had originally expected. So her whole plan was ruined because Edith misunderstood his role in her game, and everyone could see how carefully Arsene treated the impudent aristocrat. As a result, the young man carefully carried the lady to the hotel, where they had stopped specifically for a rest. Lydia could not come to her senses after what happened, which spread the wrong rumors. The heroine was not one of those people who could remain silent in such an unpleasant situation. So she immediately gave Arsene a serious talk so that he would understand his mistake. But the guy still couldn't understand why he shouldn't have helped the girl in trouble. All the heroine's words fell on deaf ears, as Edith had long had tender feelings for her. Arsene's gentlemanly manners were far stronger than his ability to feign cruelty to the public. That's why Lydia's plan was doomed from the start, even though she didn't know it. It was partly gratifying for the lady to realize that the guy had been caring so much about her since his arrival. But now all this only caused more suspicion among people, so the lady resisted. Unlike the heroine, the young man never had to deceive by showing other emotions, and the lady had time to understand how inept her friend was when it came to anger and severity. That's why she offered him a secret signal in the form of a wink to make Edith angry with her. But at the sight of such a sign, Arsene's heart began to beat faster, as he liked this view. Miss could talk about cruelty as much as she wanted, but the guy was powerless to help her. He had long been accustomed to helping the girl in everything, and now it was too late to change. So Arsene honestly admitted that winking was not an appropriate secret signal. After all, when she sees him, Edith definitely won't want to push away such a sweet and beautiful girl. The heroine still didn't understand that her actions only attracted the guy to her even more. And so Edith had already decided to compliment the Marquise's daughter, whom he liked more and more. The aristocrat's smile sank into the heart of the heroine, who had never seen such emotions in him before. She never thought that just one moment could change her opinion of the angry Arsene so much. But the latest comparison with a rabbit did not please Lydia, who remembered that monster. So Edith still received his share of well-deserved indignation, since he was careless in his words. Lydia was uncomfortable with any comparison with the animal that had scared her to death in the forest. That's why the lady threw the guy out the door, shouting that she would leave the wink as a signal. Arsene never understood why the Marquise's daughter suddenly showed so much emotion towards him. In fact, Lydia only did this because her entire face was covered with a telltale blush. The girl couldn't believe that Edith had been trying to compliment her all this time. Instead of thinking about feelings, the lady chose to focus on implementing her plan. She didn't even know that everyone around was already gossiping about Arsene's love for the visiting aristocrat. The knights had no doubt that Edith was madly in love with the Marquise's daughter. Each of them understood that it would be difficult to convince the stubborn gentleman of his feelings. But the guys still wished Arsene good luck, even if his love path would be thorny. The next morning, the heroine told her friends a slightly updated plan so that they would support her. The most important role again went to Milan, who had to guide the lady everywhere. This time, Lydia planned to achieve the goal for which she came to this city. So, early in the morning, she went to the market, where she began to buy food at exorbitant prices. The merchants constantly lied to the girl that the price of the products was even lower, especially for her. Evans had already confirmed in advance that the prices for locals were surprisingly low. But no matter how many questions the heroine asked, all the traders only gave her big numbers. Miss clearly saw the excitement that was reflected in the facial expressions and gestures of the impudent liars. The men hoped that the aristocrat would remain just as stupid and spend a lot of money. But in fact, it was they who fell into the trap. Since Lydia knew the cost of the products very well, none of the merchants expected that so many problems would suddenly arise with the rich girl. While the heroine began to destroy the counters under the pretext that she was furious, Lydia shouted to everyone around that she knew perfectly well how much the food should actually cost. No matter how much people tried to calm the girl down, at that moment, all their words sounded pathetic to her. In the end, Lydia skillfully made it so that she would only buy the seeds and grow her own food. She called Milan to personally sort out the situation and help her buy everything. The merchants looked pleadingly at the knight, who was often seen in these parts and also deceived. For this reason, the guy did not show a drop of pity to the people who did not sell them seeds and grains. Hearing this information, the heroine roared even louder, perfectly feigning rage. All of Arson's knights were delighted with Lydia's amazing acting. Meanwhile, the girl demanded a meeting with the manager to sort out the situation. Rumors of the Marquise's daughter's screams quickly spread, and she received an invitation from the landowner. But this time, the lady did not react calmly, as they wanted them to come to her. That's why the girl brazenly threw the invitation in the assistant's face, maintaining her role. The heroine had never shown so much rage and anger in her life, so she herself felt embarrassed. But she did not forget about her plan that she needed to show love to the heir of the Byron family. So Miss didn't just leave the room, deciding to play out another scene. Miss admitted that she was very tired after the walks, and did not forget to secretly wink. She hoped that it would become clear to everyone that the girl was actually completely fine. But the knight's reaction was not at all what the lady had expected. Instead, they caused a real stir, and even enlisted Arson to help Lydia. The guy immediately agreed to give the Marquis's daughter a massage to make her feel better. So he once again picked up the heroine in his arms. Although she wanted to get other actions, the lady completely stopped understanding how she should have acted in order to be rejected by her friends. It turned out that Arson knew the miss very well, but could not refuse her such help. Moreover, Edith was seriously going to give her a massage, as this would ease the girl's pain. This is how Lydia found herself in a situation where she was again surrounded by attention and care without asking. And the lady could not run away from Arson, since this would raise a lot of questions from people around. So the heroine had to accept help from the guy who tried so hard for her. She did experience a little pain, but it didn't get to the point where she needed help. What bothered the lady most was that Arson had changed so much in his communication with her. Previously, the guy was strict and harsh, but now he showed miracles of gentleness and responsiveness. And Lydia did not have time to get used to the new side of her friend that was gradually revealing itself to her. In a desperate attempt to pretend that everything was okay with her, the lady actually buried her nose in the pillow. Meanwhile, Edith began the promised massage, which he knew how to do professionally. But the guy didn't expect that Lydia would ask him to apply a little more force. All this time, he treated the girl so carefully that she almost did not feel his touch. Arson himself understood that the massage should be felt, so he changed his tactics. And finally, the heroine was able to truly relax in the capable hands of a caring friend. During all this time, the lady realized that she could no longer resort to words about her fatigue. No matter how much Lydia begged, no one could ignore the fact that she was in pain. So Arson wisely asked the Marquis's daughter to come up with other ways for them to play. Edith had no idea how difficult it was to implement plans that no one supported. But the heroine always had backup options, so she wasn't too upset this time. The girl was already going through various scenarios while she was fully enjoying the pleasant massage. She understood that it would be a good idea to invite Arson to a picnic and get rejected. Miss could also deliberately enter his personal space so that the guy would move away. While Lydia was lost in thought, Edith managed to finish giving her a gentle massage. The guy was so focused on his business that he didn't immediately notice that the girl had been fast asleep for a long time. Just like last time, he did not dare to disturb the lady from her sleep, as she had had so little rest. For some reason, Arson didn't want to leave the Marquise's daughter alone, even though this place was safe. But he stubbornly guarded her sleep, not understanding why he was behaving in such a strange way. It was he who agreed to help Lydia collect flowers, although there was no need for it. Moreover, the guy himself offered the girl a massage, which she could not refuse. Before, Arson would never have shown so much attention to a lady because he was afraid of revealing his secret. But now he didn't want to stop and reject Lydia, even though he understood where this was all leading. The next morning, the meeting between the manager and the guests of his territories finally took place. Ruzan David has always been famous for his ability to smooth over any conflicts with other people. But this time, the heroine was in a bloodthirsty mood, so she even spoke about the man's head. This man always believed that he was lucky in life, so he put little effort into prospering. He had achieved a promotion in a short time, so he thought he could easily calm down the impudent lady. But the heroine was not the kind of person who could be bribed or intimidated. That is why she immediately indicated her high position by asking for the head of a stupid man. The girl no longer planned to play the role of a stupid girl who allowed herself to be deceived. Rujhan was clearly not prepared for the fact that he would have to negotiate with a serious aristocrat. He constantly tried to justify himself by saying that he had punished the merchants, but the lady knew the whole truth about him. David broke out in a cold sweat when Lydia mentioned that he had taken a bribe again. What angered the Marquise's daughter most was that all the merchants in the city charged high prices for their goods. But the manager did nothing about it, which is why the lady had to deal with the matter personally. The man lied until the very end that he had no idea such terrible things were happening in his city. But Lydia did not believe a single word of Rujhan, whom she considered a dishonest man. She deliberately pretended to go and talk to Count Von himself. It really didn't cost the girl anything to go to the capital to restore order in the city. But for David, this meant that he would soon lose his position, and then his head. So the man abandoned all the lies and began to beg the priestess for mercy and grace. Rujhan had never been so scared in his life, so he even promised to punish all the traitors. But the heroine did not appreciate such sacrifice, since she did not need other people's heads. This refusal confused David even more, because he had nothing else to offer the important guest. Malan saw that things were gradually taking a wrong turn, so he intervened in the conversation. The assistant was aware of Lydia's plan, so he tried to lead the manager to their goal. In fact, the knight only pretended to try to help Rujhan, but he was actually driving him into a trap. But the boy's words had an effect, and David saw a completely different salvation before him. Now, the man promised that he would personally donate a lot of products to the temple to make amends. This was partly what the Marquis's daughter had been aiming for, but her face did not reveal a single joyful emotion. Meanwhile, Rujhan was showering generosity in all directions, just to preserve his status and life. As soon as the lady started talking about seeds and grains, he immediately promised to give her all the supplies. And when Cedric mentioned the herbs, Rujhan gave them to the guests as well, as he was deathly afraid of punishment. This is how the heroine easily achieved her goal, together with her assistants, who supported her plan. The girl could not have imagined that her status as the Marquise's daughter would help her so much in this matter. And in the end, Rujhan gave away almost all the resources that he currently had in stock. But Lydia did not stop there, as she also accepted gifts from the kind and generous manager. The man didn't expect that during this conversation he would be left almost without money, but he couldn't object. What interested him most was whether the guests would actually go to the capital to see the Count. Of course, no one planned to do this, but the friends did not calm down the impudent Rujhan. Only Milan hinted that if Lydia was happy with everything, then they would not do anything, so David had to come to terms with the wealth he had spent in a couple of hours. None of the knights expected that the Marquise's daughter would be so skilled in financial matters. Arsène was most impressed by how easily Lydia resolved all their problems with the products. As a test, the heroine went to the market to find out what price she would be offered this time. Previously, merchants would have definitely named a high sum in order to deceive the young aristocrat again. But this time, they were forced to give everything away for free, just to avoid the wrath of the Marquise's daughter. The heroine didn't expect that Rujhan would intimidate all the merchants so much that they would give everything away as a gift. The girl did not plan to destroy trade relations, so she put forward her own plan. The woman was clearly surprised at the sight of the coins, of which there were still more than necessary. Lydia explained this by saying that she gives a second chance to people who once made a mistake. The merchant could not even hope to be treated like that after everything she had done. Regret burst out in the form of tears of gratitude, as Madame was very grateful. Of course, the lady was now going to keep an eye on the merchants, but they no longer planned to lie. Soon the whole company had bought enough food to last the boarder for a whole year. But Lydia still had a desire to buy one thing, without which she did not want to leave. In fact, the lady did not need Arsene's permission, but for the sake of decency, she asked him. The Marquise's daughter always acted as she thought best, and only warned her friend of her actions. This is how Miss came to the conclusion that she needed to make another big purchase. None of the knights expected that this time, Lydia would not be aiming at food or clothes. The girl was relentless in her desire to acquire a real forge in this city. Arsène could have expected anything from a lady, but not such a strange decision to buy. The boys hoped that they were mistaken, that Lydia had once again confirmed all their suspicions, and Miss was already planning to start development in the mines on the border, for which she needed a forge. Of course, the heroine had no intention of telling anyone about her useful discoveries just yet. That's why she had to put up with Arson's confusion, whom she had not let into her plans. She had two big plans for this place to refuse to buy a forge in the city. The lady lied that this had been her dream since childhood, so that no one would have any more questions. She planned to stand still until Arson approved such a strange purchase. In the end, Edith had no choice but to support the decision of the Marquise's daughter. So the lady was finally able to rest over food, since all the important work was done. The only thing that confused the heroine in this situation was the gloomy face of her acquaintance. Arsène sat at the table so motionless, as if he were performing some special nightly service. However, the guy answered all the questions that he was not bored, since he was also relaxing next to the lady. At this point, Miss again took up her plan, in which Edith was supposed to push her away in public. So Lydia winked at the guy and asked him to feed her cake in order to get rejected. She hoped that Arson would pretend that he didn't like all this, but the guy didn't get the hint. Before the girl could even blink, the young man had already offered her a strawberry version of the dessert. It was only after a few minutes that Edith realized that this was all part of a game for other people. That's why Lydia winked at him so desperately, wanting to finally get the long-awaited refusal. But Arson didn't know how to play to the crowd, so his reaction wouldn't have seemed believable to anyone. The girl did not despair until the very end, trying to knock at least something resembling anger out of her friend. But Edith was unable to help the lady in realizing her plan, since he was still just as polite. Only now did the heroine realize how big her problems were from the very beginning. Arsène couldn't complete even the simplest task, but something more serious was needed here. So she gave the guy some advice on how to act around her. Edith listened to everything carefully, because he understood how important it was for his friend. But even so, the guy's face looked strange, as if he didn't know how to be angry at all. This is how the heroine failed, although she hoped that she could easily deceive the mercenaries. But Arsène now looked as if he hated cakes, and not the Marquise of Evans' daughter herself. Anxious thoughts visited the girl as she thought about how she should act next. None of Edith's actions fit into her plan, no matter how hard the lady tried to hint to him. At that moment, the guy noticed that there were remnants of cake on the girl's face, so he removed them. This action embarrassed the heroine so much that she forgot about all the other shortcomings of her acquaintance. Miss had the feeling that Arson treated the lady so delicately because he was a knight. Suddenly, a guess pierced the entire consciousness of the heroine, who had time to think about Edith's feelings. She explained to herself that he simply saw her as a comrade, and there was no other option. This reasoning made Lydia feel much calmer, although it led her to the wrong conclusion. The heroine never had real friends, so she was pleased to think about something like that. Meanwhile, Arson was still perplexed, since the girl did not tell him anything. But Miss did not always share her thoughts with Edith, as she had a great flight of fancy. This time, she only briefly said what she thought about their future, which the guy did not expect to hear. His face turned red with embarrassment, because Arsène had misinterpreted the girl's words. But Lydia didn't have the opportunity to explain anything to him, as she heard a familiar voice. At that moment, a medicine seller was walking around the hall, offering various potions. The lady instantly remembered the time in the labor camp when this man helped the sick. The young man was the only doctor among all the prisoners, which is why the lady remembered him well. It took her a few minutes to realize what kind of person she had just met, and this realization made Lydia jump up on the spot, because that guy couldn't be missed. The young man's name was Wellington Byrne, and he didn't expect a whole crowd of people to suddenly rush towards him. Things weren't going well for him in business, so the guy was very scared that the loan sharks had found him. But in reality, the heroine just wanted to talk to Byrne to win him over to her side. She remembered well that in the past, he had been a famous doctor, but had been caught selling drugs. The lady knew that this was due to huge debts from gambling and big parties. In fact, because of Wellington's skill, Miss planned to find him in this life. Who would have thought that this man, who amazed her with his skills, would come into her hands himself? Since he tried to save the people in the camp until the very end, the lady decided to give him a second chance. Cedric was the first to meet Arson and Lydia after their walk, and he had logical questions. No one expected that the gentleman would bring with him a guy who was deathly afraid of something, but Lydia successfully pretended that Wellington was her acquaintance and that she wanted to talk to him. Even when they were alone, Byrne remained visibly nervous about the unknown. He immediately realized that the girl knew him from somewhere, although he had never seen her in his life. Lydia had no plans to tell Wellington the truth, as he was unlikely to believe it, but she knew how to attract a guy's attention so that he would never run away or betray her. The heroine was ready to pay off all the doctor's debts, if only he would work only for her. This news surprised the poor young man so much that he didn't even believe that what was happening was real. Wellington always felt that none of the aristocrats cared about the young doctor, and then this beautiful girl demands that he work for her and even help with her debts. Byrne couldn't believe that there was no catch in this offer that was so tempting to him. In his place, the heroine would also not trust a man who spoke so little about himself and his knowledge. But there really was a shortage of doctors on the border, so the lady had a strong argument in her favor. Wellington had heard of this problem before, so Miss was finally able to convince him. In fact, it was not without reason that Lydia needed help from a doctor who knew many things. She knew how to treat her father's illness, which affected many people in the empire, but the girl didn't expect that every person was already well aware of this. So it came as no surprise to Byrne that a simple dandelion tea helped with the illness. The heroine planned to use this knowledge for herself, so she was not prepared for such a turn of events. Meanwhile, at the palace, Giselle was finally convinced that the dandelions worked well. She specially called the servants together to test in practice how effective the decoction was. These were not the best days for the emperor's wife, as all her dreams went down the drain. The Marquis of Evans returned to the estate, having displaced his son, and the lady had no agreements with him. That's why she listened to the rumors about dandelions that were spread by many aristocrats. It all started from the Evans family butler, who saw with his own eyes how Lydia cured her father. Before, Lydia's reputation was at rock bottom, but now every person in the empire was talking about her. And this hit Giselle very hard, whose position became extremely precarious and fragile. What the girl feared most was that people would begin to condemn her position in the imperial palace. If Lydia had not restored her reputation, the emperor's wife would not have had to worry about anything. The most terrible thing was that the Marquis no longer supported the lady he had once taken in. On one of his recent visits, Giselle begged him for forgiveness because she needed the family title. But Karl turned out to be vindictive and did not forgive the girl for never visiting him during his illness. That's how Giselle was left with nothing, although she could have seized the family of the Marquis of Evans long ago. That's why she was now making completely different plans, because her hopes were destroyed. The emperor's wife was not going to stop anymore. Even if she committed some cruelty, she planned to be remembered by people as the person who brought them dandelion medicine.